It's at this point during the discussion at the beginning of chapter 57, we're on page 551 in the book. It's at this point when they're talking about what to do with Shouter, and his murderer, Shouter, has killed. He killed the boy who was overseer before him in order to take his place. He killed him to please Genshed and prove his worthiness to Genshed to be an overseer. And they're discussing what to do about him. And Keldrick says, I think we may find several of the slave children who have no one. It's the unloved and deserted who get sold as slaves, you know. And Maleficent, remember her character story. She was born and she was bred on a slave farm. She didn't even know her father or her mother, because they were just like breeders to breed slave children, slaves. I should know, so should I, said Keldrick. God forgive me. Oh, God forgive me. She checked him with a finger held to his lips. So he's under this great emptiness, and the thing most present to Keldrick is his own evil, his own failure, and that he failed God. First, foremost, most importantly of all, and now God was gone. The opportunity to redeem himself was gone. Even though Shardik died and saved him from death, from Genshed's hand, Keldrick hasn't been redeemed yet. So we want to follow this really closely to get at the heart of what Adams is saying here, what he's showing and what he believes. Malithus checked him with a finger held to his lips, fashioned again to his purpose. So broken, but then fashioned again to his purpose. I believe at last I'm beginning to see. So now we're seeing this fullness of redemption. And Malithus, part of this fullness of redemption is she is restored to being a priestess, to being God's servant, to being his vessel. I mean, she's the one. She's the one. She's the woman that Shardik came for. It wasn't the Teginda, it was her. And her response, her breaking, her cowardice, all this was a part of, God knew that was in her. And that's what would happen. And again, this is a power of a different kind. This is a power where we can make all of the choices we like freely and in opposition to God's will for our life. And his will still have the last say. This is what I think Scripture means when it says his word will not fall void, will not return to him void. And we don't have to fulfill that word. God will do it. It's his word. It's his will that will prevail. And then Keldrick says, what are we to do? And she laughs. She goes, oh, Keldrick, my darling Keldrick, how many more times? It will be shown to us what we are to do. All we have to do is wait and be ready to perceive. This isn't something we can cook up ourselves. These are ideas beyond, if you remember when we talked about Milton, right? If we are contained within the material universe of time and space, there is no way. We have no access to know what's beyond, what's out there, unless somebody from out there comes to us and tells us about it. And so we have to be shown. We have to be aware of those moments when that kind of revelation is coming to us. And we must be having disciplined ourselves in our waiting and in obedience, then to be able to act on what we are shown. So here's the context now for the completion of Keldrick's redemptive character arc. And here we go. So back again in a little bit later, we're still in chapter 57. And we see Malithus and Keldric walking around the village as he's in very slow recovery from his wounds. On page 557, 6 pages later in the book, if you're following with me in the book, one afternoon, as he and Malithus were walking together outside the village, they came upon 5 or 6 of the former slave children who were idling among the trees. They looked warily at Keldric, but none approached or spoke. He called out to them, went closer, and did his best to talk to them as comrades, for so indeed he felt them to be. But it was not that day, nor for several days after, that he had the least success. In their silence and curt, unsmiling answers, they differed much from the children he remembered on Ortelga. Little by little, he began to understand that for nearly all their sufferings under Genshed had been only the most recent suffering in miserable lives of desertion, neglect, abuse, and pain. Parentless, friendless, helpless. They had been enslaved before ever they met Genshed. From Shouter, after 1 or 2 visits, he judged it best to keep away for the time being. The boy had been injured when Shardik charged upon Genshed, and neglect of his hurts had brought on a delirious fever of which until a few days ago he had been expected to die. He was consumed with fear and convinced the Eldeshay intended him some cruel death, and the sight of any of those whom he had ill-treated intensified his guilt and panic. So Keldric left him to Malithus and the village women, but nevertheless found himself wondering more than once what would become of him. So what would become of Shouter? Here we come there on your class notes 14. We're focused on the character of Shouter now. In the last lecture, we talked about how he and Radu are in many ways foils for each other. So here's Shouter, and is there redemption for Shouter? What a horrible, horrible young man. If you recall Radu talking about how Shouter and Bled would rape the slave girls, Genshed would pretend he didn't notice. And Shouter indeed had murdered slave children. So let's move on a few pages longer. So Elaroth shows up finally in the village and is reunited with his son Radu. And then Keldric is again out walking in the village. I'm on page 561 now. We're still in chapter 57. We're still in the falling action. Are you seeing how all of these loose ends are being wrapped up? But we haven't come to the denouement. We haven't reached the resolution yet. This is still falling action. So again, in the falling action, we have Keldric out hobbling around in the village with the children. And the novel opens, Keldric is he's called by the other villagers play with the children, Zenzuata, play with the children, because when he got home from hunting, or he wouldn't go drinking, he wouldn't go wenching, he would play with the children, play games with the children along the riverside. And away he went, hobbling and shuffling slow enough, for as he had told Elareth, he was still far from healed. That has many permutations of meaning. Yet in his heart, he went as once in the days when he'd been a young simpleton who would rather play with the children than drink with the men. So he's playing this game called Cat Got a Fish with the children that he's teaching the children. He used to play it with the Artelgan children. It's an Artelgan game. And he sees Keldric. He was resting unobtrusively behind a rock when he realized that the boy loitering near him was Shouter, but so haggard and pale that at first Keldric had not recognized him. He was playing no part in the game, but staring moodily at the ground, pacing one way and another and jabbing viciously at the stones with a stick. A second glance showed Keldrick that if Shouter was not actually weeping, he was as close to it as was possible for a boy who had spent so many months in the service of Gensha. "Are you feeling better?" asked Keldrick as Shouter came a little nearer. "Muck and stupid," answered Shouter, barely turning his head. "Come here," said Keldrick sharply. "What's brought you out here? What's the matter?" The boy made no reply, and he took him by the arm and said again, "Come on, tell me, what's the matter?" "Glad to be going, aren't they?" said Shouter in a kind of savage gasp. "Yeah, they're lucky, or they're too bloody stupid to know they're not." "Why, aren't they going home?" asked Keldrick. "Home? Well, half of them's never had a home. If they had, they wouldn't be here, would they?" "Go on," said Keldrick, gripping his arm. "Why wouldn't they?" "You know as well as I do. Kids whose mothers don't want them, fathers have mucked off, they live how they can, don't they? One day someone sells them for 40 mil to get rid of them, same as they did me. Best thing ever happened to some of them, next to being dead. Slaves. They were slaves all along, wasn't they? Well, where do you think they'll go now, then?" "How the hell should I know?" bawled Shouter with something like a return to his old form. "Leg by Muck and Lee, I shouldn't wonder. Why don't you let me alone? Just let me alone. I'm not afraid of you." And remember, so Keldrick's missed Shardik's message, and maybe he hasn't missed Shardik's message at all. Maybe he has to exercise that free will of his to its full extent and reap all the consequences of it. Before he's prepared, he's been opened up, he can perceive before he can really see when God is speaking to him at all. And then we go on and we see quick, just on the next page, immediately we move from this picture of Shouter. Remember, this is Shouter and Radu in comparison and contrast with each other. And then Keldrick goes to this dinner party that Elroth has given, and there's Radu. And on the next page, 563, here's Radu being described. The boy, though still pale and emaciated in appearance, had changed as a musician changes when he sets hand to his instrument. As in an old tale, the wretched slave boy had turned back into the heir of Sarkid, a young gentleman brought up to be deferential to his father, gracious to his father's officers, silently attentive to the conversation of his elders, and every way the equal of his station. Yet it was not all courtier, for he talked earnestly to Keldrick for some time about the slave children and about the ceremony on the shore. And when Elroth's servant, having cut up his one-handed master's meat, was about to do the same for Keldrick, Radu forestalled him, setting aside Keldrick's protest with the remark that it was less than Keldrick had done for him. Wow, here's Radu, talk about servant leadership, right? And we see Radu restored to his full inheritance, his full position, the revelation of his identity as Elroth's son. Here's the son. So the page before, we see this picture of the slave. And the page after, we see the picture of the son. And what's the difference between the two? And here's the son, and he stoops over and he feeds Keldrick. He leans over the young boy and feeds Keldrick. And when Keldrick asks Radu, what should we do about Shouter? Well, how does Radu respond? Well, I think we should forgive him. In fact, it's not what I feel, Radu says. I don't feel like forgiving him. But I feel like that's what my father would want me to do. Have we heard Raju say those words before? So there's forgiveness for shelter as well. So we've come full circle. And at this point, Erleroth at this dinner party, the whole point is to show that now that Bekla and the rebel Yeldashay have come to a treaty and a truce, and Zere has been given to the Yeldashay rebels, and now they're wanting to appoint a governor, and they want to develop it. And as it's on the edge of the Beklan frontier, it is perfectly positioned once they've figured out how to cross the Telfiarner to the other side to open up trade routes to nations and peoples never before encountered. And that's where we move finally to chapter 58. I want to quickly go back now because I want to ask you this question. How about the narrator of this story? Who is the narrator? It's a third-person narrator. He definitely seems to be omniscient. And all of the main characters in this book are believers. And we see Radu has become a believer, and Elroth, his father, has become a believer in Shardik. And there's a passage that kind of reveals some things about the identity of our narrator. And remember, narrator is related to point of view. And if we really want to understand what an author is doing and what he's saying in a book, we need to find that point of view and find out what's going on with the point of view. And in chapter 56, with the passing of Shardik, we do have the narrator intruding, if you will, on the narrator. He's actually backing out. Okay, and so now we're finding where the narrator actually is. We're finding out something about the identity of the person telling the story. That's on page 543. It's in chapter 46. And the narrator, the opposed Melithus, is doing the rites over Shardik's body. Keldric's there. They're at the edge of the river. Shardik's on the raft with Shara between his paws, getting ready to light the fire that'll burn the body up, send him back to heaven, supposedly. And here the narrator suddenly intrudes, and he says this: how many times has that scene been depicted? Carved in relief on stone, painted on walls, drawn with brush and ink on scrolls, scratched with pointed sticks in the wet sand of the Telfiana shore. On one side, the fishermen and the peasants. On the other, the unarmed soldiers, the handful of children beside the fire. First, the very first of all those to bless the name of Lord Shardik. The first to bless the name of the Lord Shardik. The man supported on the soldier's arm, the woman, capital W, standing alone before the bodies on the floating pyre. The sculptors and the painters have done what was required of them, finding ways to reflect the awe and wonder in the hearts of people who have known the story since they were little children themselves. The fisher folk, handsome, strong young men, fine old patriarchs and their grave dames, face the resplendent soldiers in their red cloaks, each a warrior to conquer 1,000 hearts. The man's unhealed wounds bleed red upon the stones. The woman is robed like a goddess. Light streams from Lord Shardik's body upon the kneeling children. And the little girl smiles as though in her sleep, nestling between the strong, protecting limbs of the bear. The fire burns lambent, the regular wavelets lap white as wool upon the strand. Perhaps, who can tell, this is indeed the truth, sprung like an oak from an acorn long vanished into the earth. You hear what's happening? The author, the narrator, the storyteller is retelling this story from a point in the far distant future. And he's retelling it from a point where there's been hundreds of years, generations and generations of believers and where the story has been retold and portrayed in the art of empires. And it's been, in the retelling and in the paintings, it's been cleansed, if you will. It's been stylized. He's describing what happened, what has happened in Western art, in the paintings of the manger and of the cross and of the resurrection of Jesus. It's not like any of those people were ever there. The storyteller is a believer. There's children calling on the first call on the blood. The storyteller is speaking from in the distance, from a line of people who've been blessed by these events. And then he goes, what's the truth from the ragged muttering peasants, one or two already edging away to the evening chores, the half-comprehending soldiers simply obeying orders, the clothes and armor mended and burnished, showing every sign of a hard campaign and a forced march from Shouter, trying for dear life to squeeze out a few tears from Cowderek's uncontrollable trembling, Melithus's weary, dark-ringed eyes and homespun robe, from the grubby village flotsam bobbing in the shallows, and the sorry huddle on the raft. These things were not remarked or felt at the time, and now they have long since disappeared, mere grains succeeded by the massive trunk above and the huge spread of roots below. Wow. So this is a believer. The story is being given to us, and here we discover the identity of our narrator as a believer and as someone who's speaking from a point far after these events have happened in the distant future. And that brings us now quickly to chapter 58. And this is where the denouement, where the resolution and all these loose ends are tied up. And how Adams does this is he jumps 5 years in advance, maybe it's 3 years. Anyway, Cowderic and Melithus are married. Cowderic is the governor of the new province of Zare under the Yaldache. And we see this, and they have created in Zare a place for unwanted children. So here, all of the unwanted, deserted children who desire to, who wish to, can come and find a home. And in this, we find Shardik's message, and we encounter this ending by this ambassador from a foreign country who is coming to Bekla for the first time from across the Telthiarna. They've built this bridge, Belcatraz, it's kind of rough crossing of the Telthiarna. And so we have this foreign ambassador coming, Siristru. So this is the character on your notes at the first notes for Shardik at the very bottom of the far right corner, Siristru. He's the envoy, the ambassador from the king of Zakalan, an unknown country until they had first been able to cross the Telthiarna and start exploring. And now we're seeing the world of the Beklan Empire being opened up. There are other people groups, there are other empires, there are other civilizations beyond the boundaries of Bekla. And in chapter 58, we find out the wrap up of the story, that what was the message? What was it? And Cowderic, after the death of Shardik, after these things, when he's made governor of Zare, all these things together, he and Melithus have been shown. And this is what they have been shown. So with the coming of Siristru, then he's coming, he's brought horses. The Beklans have never seen horses. Horses have never been a part of the landscape. So it's a brand new kind of animal. And he and Cowderic are talking about what they can trade, about some kind of treaty between the empires, a way of opening up new venues of trade here with horses. And then Siristru admires Melithus's embroidery and the fine cloth and the Telgan rope, and he's looking for things that would be of value that he could sell back in his country of Zakalan. And in the midst of these negotiations between them, Keldric, the governor, they talk. And on page 595, and I'll close up with this. I'll point out a couple of important passages for you to review and think about, and you should have some kind of understanding of how they communicate the theme of Shardik and how they represent what Adams is saying about the power of evil not just being resisted, as we see in Radu, how it's resisted, but how it is overcome. Good, where evil used to be only, is the overcoming of evil, transforming evil into good. And this is part of the character of arc of Shouter and why that character arc is so important. So page 595, they're talking, and Siristu asks Keldric, the governor, I'm puzzled by the children. What little I've seen of them. Your town seems full of children. I saw them working at the landing station, in your warehouses. 2/3 of the inhabitants here must be children. Yeah, 2/3, that's about right, says Keldric. They're not all the children of the people who live here, then. Oh, so no one's told you about the children, said the governor. No, of course, there's hardly been time. Oh, no, they come from many different places. Bakla, Ikat, Thetit, Dari, or Telga. There are even a few from Tarakanal. They're all children who've lost parents or families for one reason or another. A lot of them have simply been deserted, I'm afraid. They're not compelled to come here, although for many it's better than destitution, I suppose. It's a hard life, but at least they feel that we need them and we value them. That in itself helps them a great deal. Who sends them? Oh, I'm in touch with all manner of people, said Keldric. People who work for me used to send me news and so on in the days when I lived in Bakla. And the band of Sarkid helps us a great deal as well. Siristu could not help feeling a certain distaste. Apparently this young governor, in his enthusiasm for trade, was developing his province and building up Zaray as a port to the labor of destitute children. How long are they compelled to remain, he said. Oh, they're not compelled. They're free to go if they want to. But most of them have nowhere else to go. Then you wouldn't say they were slaves. Well, they're slaves when they come here. Slaves of neglect, desertion, slaves sometimes of actual cruelty. We try to free them, but it's anything but easy. Siristu began to see a connection between this and certain things which the young woman had said to him in their earlier conversation. Has this something to do with Lord Shardik? You've heard then about Lord Shardik. Your wife spoke of him about a festival too. And the ferrymen were chanting this morning on the raft, Shardik gave his life for the children, Shardik gave his life for the children. I should be interested to hear a little more if you would care to tell me about this Shardik. I have an interest in such matters. And in my own country, I've been a kind of religious teacher, you might say. So the governor, who was gazing into his silver cup and swirling the wine in it, looked up and grinned. Now, when you listen to chapter 58 in full today, make note of this passage. That's more than I am or ever shall be. I'm not particularly handy with words, though fortunately I don't need them to serve Lord Shardik. The teaching, as you call it, is simply that there isn't to be a deserted or unhappy child in the world. In the end, that's the world's only security. Children are the future. If there are no unhappy children, then the future would be secure. He spoke with a kind of unassuming assurance, as a mountain guide might speak to travelers of passes and peaks through which he knows well. Siristu had not understood all that he said, and finding it difficult to ask questions in the other's language, fell back on the repetition of the words he did know. You said slaves of neglect and desertion. What does that mean? The governor rose, paced slowly across to the window, and stood looking out to the harbor. His next words came hesitantly, and Siristru realized with some surprise that apparently he had seldom had occasion to try to even express himself on this subject before. Children, they're born of mutual pleasure and joy, or they ought to be. And God means them to grow up, well, watertight, like a sound canoe, fit to work and play, buy and sell, laugh and cry. Slavery. Now listen to this definition. Real slavery is being robbed of any chance of being complete, being whole. What do you think that has to do with Adam's definition of evil? The unwanted, the deprived, and the deserted. They're slaves, all right, even if they don't know it themselves. Well, perhaps there are some deserted children who don't mind too much. Why, Siristru replied. Well, which one of them told you that? Asked the governor. Shardik, Siristru said, ignoring Keldric. He was a bear, you say? Yes, Lord Shardik was a bear. And he was coming from God? I'm afraid I don't know the word. Divine? Ah, yes, thank you. Yes, he was the power of God, but he was an actual bear, said the governor. This was long ago. Oh, no, I myself was present when he died. You? The governor said no more, and after a few minutes, Siristru, now genuinely interested, hazarded, a bear? And yet you speak of his teaching. How did he teach? He made plain to us by his sacred death, the governor replied, the truth we had never understood. Siristru, mildly irritated, refrained from shrugging his shoulders. Wouldn't it be possible for some foolish person to try to argue? Of course, it would be foolish, but perhaps it could be said that what took place was all a matter of chance and accident, and that the bear was not really sent by God. Now get this response that Adams puts in the mouth of the governor. He broke off, somewhat dismayed. Certainly he had said more than he needed. He did not want to offend the governor. And the governor was silent for so long that Siristru feared he must have given offense. To have done so would be a nuisance, and he would have to set to work immediately to repair the damage. He was going to try to do this when the governor looked up, half smiling, like one who knows his mind, but must needs laugh at his own difficulty in expressing it. Those beasts of yours that you spoke of, the ones we're going to buy from you, you sit on their backs and they carry you swiftly. The horses, said Siristru. Yes, they must be intelligent animals, cleverer than oxen, I suppose. It's hard to say. Perhaps a little more intelligent. Why? If music were played in their hearing and in ours, I suppose their ears would catch all the actual sounds that yours and mine would catch. Yet for all that, it's little they'd understand. You and I might weep at the sound of that music, but they wouldn't. The truth, those who hear it are in no doubt. Yet there are always others who know for a fact that nothing out of the ordinary took place. There's one more very important passage in chapter 58, right after this one, in Shardik. I challenge you as you listen or read the full chapter assigned for today. Can you find that passage? It might be important for preparing for the final exam. God bless you all. See you on Friday.